All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to have everyone here. For those of you watching virtually, thank you for joining us. My name is Ricardo Alvarez. I am a doctor in history and assistant professor here at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. I'm very excited for the next installment in our book series, book talk series of the 2022-23 cycle. Today, we're fortunate enough to have with us Dr. Robert Weis, who will be giving a presentation on his book, For Christ and Country, Militant Catholic Youth in Post-Revolutionary Mexico. The comments will be offered afterward by Dr. Ariadna Guerrero, who is based in Mexico, and Dr. Nathan Elstrand, who is now in San Diego. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our author first. I will give him a chance to tell us a little bit about the work. Then I will introduce our speakers and then give them an opportunity to give a comment. We'll give Robert a chance to respond to the comments, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, right? So thank you for joining us. Robert Weis is a history professor at the University of Northern Colorado. He is the author of Bakers and Basques, A Social History of Bread in Mexico, published in 2012 by University of New Mexico Press, and For Christ and Country, Militant Catholic Youth in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, published by Cambridge in 2019. He earned an MA in Latin American Studies from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico and a PhD in history from UC Davis, right? Robert, we're very happy to have you here. Whenever you have a chance, take it away. We'd love to learn more about the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo, for pulling this together. And thank you. Well, thank you to you and Nathan. You've done a whole lot to bring us together too. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So the genesis of this book has different aspects. One is that I was in the dark halls of the Mexico City Municipal Archives, which has very valuable joyas. But I had been in there for weeks, literally counting pieces of coal, of carbon. I was trying to trace the history of Mexico City's kitchens. And since most people used carbon as their fuel, I wanted to start there. And it was one day when I came out for a little bit of sun, and I thought, there has to be a better way. There has to be something more interesting than this. And I had been thinking about León Toral for a long time, in part because no one had written a book on him. Everyone kind of has to mention him at some point in some depth or another, usually in a single clause, if they even name him or just leave him as a Catholic fanatic. But I know that if you kill the president of Mexico, you're probably going to generate a hell of a lot more documentation than if you're burning and buying or selling coal. So I thought, I think I'm really going to change things. And this also came up kind of around the same time. Writers like Ben here, Matthew Butler, Adrian Banches, and other folks were really bringing up some fascinating research, ideas, case studies about the overlooked aspects of religion, religiosity, and various manifestations that historians of the revolutionary era hadn't contemplated in much or any depth. And if religion came up, or notions of spirituality, or different ways of understanding and conceiving of the universe, they didn't make their way into most of the monographs. To the degree that religion at all appeared in most of the historiography of the revolution, it was in real black and white terms. They were not religious itself, but political. That is, the church as a political actor. In Mexico and other parts of Latin America, but as a force of reaction against the revolution. And Ben Butler and Bunches and other folks as well, of course, really problematized that and really opened up a whole new, for me at least, a whole new way to think about both the revolution, people who identified as revolutionaries, the religiosity that comes into their own thinking consciously or not, intentionally or not, but also into the ways of the people who opposed the revolution. And so I wanted to contribute to that project. I wanted to have a research project with lots of documentation. And to my, especially even after my bread book, which involved, it was more like, picking blackberries. Here, I just had, a whole blackberry factory, tubs of blackberries that no one was looking at. I had, not to mention, the entire transcription of his court hearings. I had his diaries, I had his letters, I have police files, his drawings, not to mention the materials of the press, which are extensive. And so I thought, this is it. This is the project for me. I checked at least 2 boxes. One is this really exciting field that's opening up. Another is ample documentation. But I also, at this time, together with other colleagues in my department, we've been really working much more consciously about how to implement exercises of historical thinking. Not just giving lip service to historical thinking, but really putting it at the center of our pedagogy in ways that we hoped could be more engaging for students, more empowering for students. And me, after I've been at this university for 15 years now, I was done lecturing per se. And so this project brought up something that I hadn't really expected it would, and which was getting me to think about empathy. And I know that among history, people who study history education, empathy has its own kind of category in ways that don't always coincide with mine, but historians tend to write about people whose causes we support, admire, or we find inspiring in some way, or whose tragedies we are passionate or compassionate about. This was not this project. I have, but how could it be? This was not a movement that, and there's another thing in Mexico, of course, where things tend to be, fairly polarized, especially around writing about the Catholic Church. There are either people who write for or for against, is my impression, at least in the readings. And here I have kind of no velo en el entierro, as it were, of Obregón or León de Toral. But how can I, as a historian, tell the story of a person that I share almost nothing with? And I had the pictures, which is why I really wanted to have them on the cover, because I had these pictures of them. These are their mug shots when they're pulled into the police department after the murder of Obregón. And I just had them on my office wall, and they're just staring at me, and it just got me to think about different ways of doing history, like beyond. And I'm not trained in visual analysis, but I mean, just what does his eyes mean? What does her smirk mean? What does his hairdo mean? What does her what do her sad eyes mean? As it just got me thinking more about how can I empathize with people. And of course, this is I say this about historical thinking because we might admire Bolivar or Zapata, but the past is another country, and so we have to start from a position of remoteness, of ignorance, but how can we still develop a sense of empathy and learn to ask different types of questions? So for me, this was an exercise in which I felt I learned tremendous amount and matured as a historian and an educator, and kind of, I don't know, in other ways as well. So that got me to which at least I found as the hook in the introduction was, what if for a second we stopped using the term fanatic and we stopped using that as an explanatory tool? I might still think he's a fanatic. I'm not really sure. I think if you think you're going to change the world by killing somebody, I think that title might fit you. But what happens if we just get rid of that? Maybe that's more an obstacle than an explanation. And what about all the other people who do all kinds of killing that we don't, attach that category to either? Why is it that he is consistently associated with that? And that got me to this idea that in fact is an obstacle to historical thinking, of even getting close to empathizing with someone, to the sense, and let me just define what I mean by empathy. And this is probably not how other historians do it, but how do we paint a portrait of a subject in the past that own subject would recognize, at least as part of our endeavor? And certainly they're not calling themselves fanatics, so why should I? And that opened up all kinds of doors for me. I don't believe that there's a más allá. That doesn't matter. That doesn't have nothing to do with it. These people do. These people believe that Mexico has a sacred bond with divine forces. And I need to take that seriously. So for me, that was a huge jump, certainly from studying more material, or apparently at least material factors like bakers who are on strike and struggling for better wages, and kind of the class alliances that could help or hinder that process, which are, of course, part and parcel of a historian's toolbox as well. But this was an entirely different journey that I hadn't anticipated at all. And my only regret is that I didn't put in the title and the assassination of Alvaro Obregón, because one could look at the book and really have no idea what it's about. What it's about. I really buried the lead on that one, and which is one thing that I would certainly change. I'm not sure that that's the best explanation or presentation of the book. I'm really glad to be part of this forum. I don't know if I don't consider myself a history of Catholic Mexico. I consider myself a historian of early 20th century Mexico. And if I can get that through bread, I'll do it. If I can get it through Catholic militants, I'll do it. And I'm honored to be in this group. And this was certainly a lot of learning for me to do this book, for me to even start to empathize with people who believe in God, and God is an important part in their life. I read up on how to pray. I read up on what it means to pray. And I don't know if that's actually, I was talking to Eddie Rios, and he's like, well, no one I know prays like that. But I was thinking about, for example, and these kind of details that will come to me and make this project really exciting. I never really thought, I grew up, nominally going to church, and I said the Lord's Prayer probably several times. But I never really thought about thy will be done, no? Hágase tu voluntad. Hágase tu voluntad. In Spanish, it like worked even better, because it's like, hágase tu voluntad. And that sense of surrender, I'm surrendering myself. haz de mí de tu voluntad. And so the way that helped me, at least in my interpretation, get a little bit closer to the motives of José de León Toral were, for example, I can't shoot straight. He literally picked up a gun, once or twice in his life. And so practicing shooting, which he did, of course, once, would have been cheating. Because this was about faith. And if my bullet manages to reach his heart, then I will know that I am indeed fulfilling God's will. So if that's fanaticism or not, it might be. I don't care. I just wanted to get to what he was thinking and what they were thinking, and also the ways in which that thinking, his thinking, and his actions were certainly far from being the isolated actions of one person. And I wanted to show that this was a generational movement. Not only generational, I mean, it certainly had generational aspects, but there was lots of people who celebrated his achievement, and those folks have not really gotten much of a history. So that would be all for me to say. I could kind of go on for a while, and you can see probably why I have stopped giving lectures to my students.
That was great. Thank you. I really appreciate it, actually. It was a great presentation, especially those of us who work on and with these lay groups of that time period. I really appreciated hearing about your own positioning and approach to these historical actors. So I'm sure that'll also give us something to talk about in the Q&A. I want to go ahead and now introduce our first comment from Doctora Ariadna Guerrero. Right, I will read her biography, which is in Spanish, and she will deliver her comments to us in Spanish as well. La doctora Ariadna Guerrero Medina es doctora en Historia Moderna y Contemporánea por el Instituto de Investigaciones José María Luis Mora. Actualmente es asistente de investigación en el CIDE y docente en el Instituto de Educación Media Superior de la Ciudad de México. Su principal línea de investigación es la historia de las organizaciones católicas en México durante el siglo XX. Sus publicaciones más recientes son Ciudadanos y feligreses frente al artículo 130 de la Constitución de 1917, en la publicación Las derechas mexicanas frente a la Constitución, siglos XX y XXI, publicada en 2021. Muchas gracias, Ariadna, por estar acá. Te escuchamos.
Buenas tardes a todos. Pues representando al público hispano, pues voy a hablar en español. Y bueno, también un poco por la carga de trabajo, pues ya me impidió hacer la traducción de todo lo que recuperé del texto. Y bueno, en principio, pues quiero agradecer a quienes dirigen la red de historiadores del catolicismo mexicano, Elizabeth Cejudo, Nathan Elstrand y Ricardo Álvarez Pimentel por su invitación para presentar el libro de Robert Weis. Y bueno, me siento muy honrada de compartir este espacio con el autor de este texto y evidentemente con Nathan Elstrand también. Bueno, inicio la lectura de mis comentarios. A través de una especie de ejercicio que podríamos calificar como prosopografía, es decir, el estudio de las generaciones, Robert Weis nos presenta en su más reciente obra la historia de León Toral, el asesino confeso de Álvaro Obregón, y de su generación. Me refiero a un conjunto, a un grupo de jóvenes católicos que crecieron y maduraron de la mano de la violencia desatada por la Revolución Mexicana. Jóvenes que desdeñaron la condescendencia con la que la generación anterior a ellos, la generación de católicos anteriores a ellos, habían convivido con las leyes liberales que Porfirio Díaz nunca derogó. una generación de jóvenes inexpertos, pero también arrojados, que miraron con cierta angustia ese mundo, esa Ciudad de México de los años 20, en donde pues empezaban a proliferar nuevas modas, nuevos bailes, la vida nocturna de los cines, de los bares, las mujeres con cabello corto, y estas chicas modernas de las que el autor habla y que interpretaron todas estas nuevas modas como símbolos de una época de frivolidad, indecencia e inmoralidad. Y es interesante esta descripción que nos da el autor, porque para los católicos esto que se estaba convirtiendo en un mundo de indecencia, de inmoralidad y de frivolidad, es, en otros términos, pues la ciudad que describe Salvador Novo, ¿no? En sus memorias, en su autobiografía, desde la transgresión, pero es esa misma ciudad de México de los años 20 que está en crecimiento, que se está modernizando luego de los años de la violencia revolucionaria, y es interesante mirarla desde la perspectiva católica o bien desde otro tipo de concepciones como la de Salvador Novo, pero las descripciones pues apuntan a esa misma urbe en transformación. Y es esta misma generación la que miraría con profunda preocupación también a los gobiernos emanados de la Revolución Mexicana y concretamente al ímpetu anticlerical y secularizador que representaba para estos jóvenes una obra de injusticia, una obra de barbarie y de descatolización que urgía detener a toda costa. La obra de Robert Weis está construida sobre una lúcida argumentación que recuerda e invita a ver lo fructífero de emprender el estudio del pasado desde preguntas claras y sencillas, desde interrogantes sobre lo ya dicho, que inciden puntualmente sobre aquellos episodios cuyo conocimiento pareciera acabado. Robert Weis parte de la pregunta acerca de por qué León Toral asesinó a Obregón. ¿Por qué? Porque algunas personas que lo rodeaban lo obligaron, porque fue un instrumento de los callistas, una marioneta, porque fue un pelele, un místico, una especie de donadie, como lo calificaron las autoridades que lo juzgaron y que lo sentenciaron bajo el calificativo de ser un fanático religioso. Y creo que aquí está una de las grandes contribuciones del libro, es decir, la reflexión sobre este término que ya apuntaba Robert Weis, sobre esta palabra que es una palabra tramposa, es parte de estas palabras promiscuas, como las denomina Mauricio Tenorio. La palabra tramposa aquí es el fanatismo, ¿no? Y me permito citar unas líneas del libro de Robert Weis. Mi objeción hacia el fanatismo no tiene nada que ver con las acciones y creencias de aquellos llamados fanáticos. El fanatismo no tiene una fuerza sustantiva, no tiene un poder explicativo más allá sino que es una tautología. La tautología aquí es: León Toral mató a Obregón porque él era fanático. León Toral era fanático, por lo tanto decidió matar a Obregón. Y lo que nos presenta el autor entonces es una categoría que se ha repetido no solo es decir, por los sujetos históricos que está estudiando, sino que varias generaciones también de historiadores han seguido repitiendo y calificando a León Toral como un fanático. Y el autor aquí nos recuerda que el fanatismo pues pareciera una categoría histórica, monolítica, invariable, que, como él dice, no tiene una capacidad explicativa. Y a partir de la consideración de este adjetivo tan repetido en parte de la historiografía, es que la obra de Robert Weis se dirige a explicar entonces a León Toral y a los suyos desde sus circunstancias, sus desafíos, sus preocupaciones, sus miedos, sus anhelos, desde sus propios términos, como dice el autor. Robert Weis estudia a León Toral y a los miembros de su generación de católicos, calzándose los zapatos del muerto. Y así logra entender esta espiritualidad profunda, esta mística y esta espiritualidad profunda que creo que se agudizan durante los años en los que está suspendido el culto, el ejercicio del culto, o sea, de 1926 a 1928, que se da el asesinato de Obregón. Y es una espiritualidad que está representada en el texto como una espiritualidad que se agudiza a través o en el medio de este culto clandestino que va a caracterizar a León Toral, a la Madre Conchita y a otros personajes con los que él convivió, ¿no? Entonces hay una mezcla de espiritualidad, de misticismo, de compromiso social también, de una generación que concibe, y de una generación, y de este caso en concreto del personaje de León Toral, que llegan a la conclusión de la violencia como el único medio para redimir, es una violencia redentora, una violencia que se presenta como el único medio para redimir a una nación que se hundía en la impiedad. Dirigida por un gobierno que en efecto en ese momento se presenta para muchos como un gobierno tiránico. Y aquí creo que viene otra de los grandes aportes del texto, ¿no? Que aún en el medio académico pues seguimos o suele prevalecer la imagen de Obregón pues como el gran caudillo de la revolución, y olvidamos la mirada de muchos de sus contemporáneos, en este caso de católicos, que tenían muy presente los actos de violencia, el anticlericalismo que Obregón había desatado durante los primeros años de la revolución, que tenían muy presentes pues los asesinatos políticos que habían ido acompañando el ascenso al poder de Obregón, y que por eso lo califican como un tirano, y que ahí esta parte a partir de este término de un gobierno tiránico, pues está la justificación de las acciones de León Toral, ¿no? Entonces, el personaje pues aquí llega a la conclusión de hacer este uso de una violencia redentora, que tenía que hacer uso también, que exaltar la virilidad, y esto es como uno de los conceptos claves sobre los que trabaja el autor, porque esta exaltación de la virilidad tenía que, en la lógica de la generación de católicos como de León Toral, tenía que sobreponerse a ese catolicismo afeminado, en contraposición, este catolicismo afeminado, transigente y condescendiente, es decir, este catolicismo que parecía indiferente a los ataques que el gobierno de Calles, y que se esperaba que Obregón continuara así con estos ataques a la iglesia. Entonces, aquí me permito citar unas palabras de un documento que yo encontré por mi tesis doctoral, un documento en donde Miguel Palomar y Vizcarra, que sería parte de esta generación, de la generación de católicos de León Toral, de estos católicos inexpertos, pero arrojados, en donde Miguel Palomar y Vizcarra decía que León Toral representaba la defensa valiente de un catolicismo viril frente a aquellos otros que eran agachones, beatos, infelices, azorrillados, tímidos y cobardones. Entonces, en el texto, creo que no solo vemos esta simbiosis entre religión y política, sino esta este binomio que también nos permite entender cómo se concebía en este momento, en los años 20, esa fusión entre religión y política, que es lo viril, el catolicismo viril frente al catolicismo afeminado, es decir, el catolicismo que lucha, que se defiende, que puede hacer uso de cualquier medio, incluyendo la violencia, el martirio, para defender lo que se consideraban los derechos de la Iglesia, la justicia, la caridad, y para encaminar hacia la nación, o sea, salvarla de ese destino de impiedad, y encaminarla a lo que todos estos buscaban, que era el reino de Cristo. Y bueno, la segunda, otra de las grandes contribuciones del texto, creo que está en el estudio, en el seguimiento detallado del juicio que se le hace a León Toral. Porque creo que esta es una de las aportaciones, porque ahí lo que vemos es cómo se despolitiza en ese momento la acción de León Toral, cómo se despolitiza el asesinato que él cometió, ese tiranicidio. Y se despolitiza por varias razones. Y así ha pasado a la historiografía como un asesinato cometido por un fanático, y se han perdido las causas políticas, la percepción de Obregón en este momento como un tirano, ¿no? Y entonces se despolitiza por dos vías. La primera es por las propias autoridades, o sea, por los representantes de ese nuevo Estado postrevolucionario, que quieren mostrarse como un gobierno racional, moderno, que aplica con precisión y con racionalidad las leyes. Y que llega a la conclusión de que, bueno, el gran caudillo revolucionario pues no tenía enemigos políticos, no tenía por qué ser asesinado, sino que muere porque a un loco fanático pues radicalizado por sus creencias religiosas se le ocurrió matarlo. Y esa es una de las vías de la despolitización. Y la segunda es el propio León Toral, o sea, el propio sujeto contribuye a la despolitización de su acción para mostrarse ante las autoridades, ante el público que lo escuchaba, porque el juicio se transmite por radio, es el último juicio público que se hace en México, entonces pues sabe que mucha gente lo está escuchando, que sus argumentos están siendo difundidos. Y entonces León Toral, él mismo despolitiza su acción para presentarse como un mártir, porque el mártir debía estar por encima de toda disputa política. El mártir era pues un instrumento de Dios, un ser que, como decía el autor hace un momento, pues permitía que Dios hiciera en él su voluntad, que no actuaba según las desavenencias políticas, sino que actuaba en nombre de algo más trascendente, que era encaminar a la nación al reino de Cristo. Y creo que esto creo que de aquí surgirán más reflexiones de cómo el acto, el asesinato de Obregón, se despolitiza en ese momento, pero pasa de esa manera, pasa despolitizado a varias generaciones de historiadores que creo que así lo han repetido. O sea, la imagen de León Toral pues suele verse como la de un loco, como un radical que de manera casi solitaria pues se le ocurre la idea de matar a Obregón, casi como si fuera un acto irracional, fuera de toda racionalidad, ¿no? Y creo que la obra nos conduce a las circunstancias históricas del personaje, a los términos bajo los cuales él llega a la conclusión de que la única solución para el país en ese momento, para salvar a la nación, es realizar un acto de violencia, pero no de cualquier tipo de violencia, no la violencia como los asesinatos que se cometían para escalar al poder, sino una violencia redentora. Y bueno, creo que hasta ahí dejaría mis comentarios. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ariadna. Estuvo súper interesante este comentario. He tomado muchos apuntes aquí. Me gusta mucho la conversación entre el trabajo de tu propia tesis y la investigación que has hecho sobre la ACJM y este libro. Entonces me da mucho gusto que hayas podido dar este comentario y ser parte de este encuentro. Claro, por supuesto, gracias a ti. Y ahora, now it's time for our second comment. And this one is from Dr. Nathan Elstrand, who is here now and is one of our leading members here of HisCatMex and has also helped me organize all of these book talks that we've had and our archivist series, etc. I'm really happy that Nathan is here, and I look forward to hearing his thoughts on Robert's book. And just a brief bio. Nathan is a postdoctoral DPAA Research Partner Fellow at San Diego State University, supporting the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency and teaching courses in public history. He holds a PhD in history from Loyola University, Chicago. He is interested in 20th century political and religious history between the United States and Latin America. He is currently working to convert his dissertation into a book, as most of us here are, well, some of us. His project examines the anti-communist, Catholic, and nationalist Mexican Unión Nacional Sinarquista within the context of the United States during World War II. His work for his master's in Latin American Studies at the University of California, San Diego, covered women's leadership in the anarchist Partido Liberal Mexicano, while the party was in exile in early 20th century Los Angeles. He has also conducted research and presented on the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. Nathan is a co-founder and co-coordinator of the HisCatMex Academic Network. Thank you, Nathan. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. And I just, want to give thanks to HisCatMex for putting on this presentation today. But in particular, I want to give thanks to Dr. Robert Weis for your excellent book, which I'm a big fan of. And I want to give you a little context of how I originally heard about the book as well. Which I'll do in a second. But before I delve into that, I just want to say my comments won't be as formal as Dr. Guerrero's comments, but I really enjoyed the book, and I'm going to kind of touch on various pieces. I'll first start off with kind of a variety of comments, and then I'll go into kind of a series of questions after that. But how I originally found out about this book, more than anything else, was one of my committee members at Loyola University Chicago while I was doing my PhD is Dr. Gemma Lopez Santamaria. And she recommended this book to me. She said, Nathan, this book just came out. This was back in 2019. And she said, you should give it a read. And I'm so glad I did, because in my opinion, we read so many works of history, not that I'm putting this down, right? But works of history that are very kind of formulaic in terms of how they're written. And what I loved about your book, Dr. Weis, is that it's very much formed like a novel more than anything else. Like I felt like I'm kind of along for the ride and learning so much about the story along the way. And I think that's always a good sign of a history, right? Is it has an argument built in, it still engages with the literature, but along the way, the narrative is so captivating that kind of brings you along. So I went to really kind of start off talking about that. I would say that the argument itself, right, is extremely fascinating. And as you talked about, and as Dr. Guerrero talked about, right, looking at the past through the person who committed the action rather than how are they seen from the outside in. I think that's really interesting, right? Kind of more from the inside out, right? They see themselves as taking down a tyrant rather than being a fanatic, right? And I think that's important, right? That gives agency to the historical actor, whether or not you agree with them. I think that as the reader, you can kind of see what was the historical context leading up to the point where they committed that action, right? In the case of León Toral, when he assassinated Obregón. So I think, it's interesting too, right? Especially thinking about this context, right? That you place León Toral in the midst of an anti-clerical context, right? And then you provide that long history of this context too, going back to La Reforma, right? Going back to Benito Juárez in the mid-1800s, mid-19th century. And you bring it up all the way to the anti-clerical Calles presidency. And by that point, right, by the late 1920s, we see an explicitly anti-clerical regime, right? And at that point, it really shows the context of like, what are you going to do? Are you just going to go along with the post-revolutionary government, or are you going to speak up, or are you going to do something, right? You can take action. And so I think that having that long context is super helpful. It's interesting too how you kind of lay out the chapters as well, right? The first 3 chapters provide kind of a broader context back to the Reforma all the way up to the 1920s, whereas the latter 3 chapters much more kind of delve into ACJM, and also delve into thinking about Leon Dural. And I like that too. I think that still works. Like I said, as a novel, you could even see this too, right? Have forming the context, and you kind of leading up to the apex, and then working your way down from there. Apex, really, what we see is in chapter 5 when he commits the action, right? And then chapter 6 and the conclusion is really kind of tying up and resolving what happened. All along the way, I'm noticing the material that you have in footnotes, which is wonderful. So, right, you're driven by these archival materials to create a fluid narrative, right? So rather than, what could happen in a book like this is you can have like the sources kind of speaking, for the kind of, you're saying he says this in this piece and this in this piece, but instead, really like the sources are kind of speaking for themselves, right? It's like we're following him along the way in terms of his thought processes as well as his beliefs. Some of the kind of now I'm going to kind of transition my comments thinking more about kind of themes I'm noticing throughout the book. But kind of some of the things I'm noticing throughout the book, one being martyrdom, of course, which Dr. Guerrero just talked about, which I think is a huge theme. And this is in particular, since you published your book, we've seen authors who have been part of this network, like Marisol Lopez Menendez and Gemma Lopez Santa Maria and others really deal with martyrdom, right? So I really think of this book in conversation with this other literature more broadly on the history of Mexican Catholic martyrdom, right? And I think that's kind of a subfield. And so I really love kind of how this delves into that. I think another thing too, another theme I'm noticing in this book more broadly is the theme of like mystery or adventure. I know that's kind of a weird comment to say as a historian, but I think, reading this book, you kind of situate it as a mystery book. Like, why exactly did he commit the act? Why exactly did he assassinate? We're going to find out, right? And then you go along the chapters to find out why, and then hence the adventure component too, right? Like we're along for the ride to see what's happening. Another theme or kind of similar themes is, in some ways, this is a microhistory, right? You're focusing on one person, and you're following them along the way, but you're kind of, ballooning out to the broader context. So I think this is really interesting, right? You're kind of focused on a particular set of sources, but then you're making it more broader, which I think really works. And then, kind of tied to that, right, the microhistory comment, it's also a deep dive, right? And I think that it kind of just reiterates what I just said. Some other themes here, right? There's a focus on urban Catholic militancy, which I think is particularly important, right? Because so much of the literature that we've seen about the Cristiada, by the First Cristero War, especially in the kind of latter half of the 20th century, even living up to today, is very much focused on the rural conflict, right? In the Bajío, right? That's what most of the literature is about. And I was glad to see, right, that this is focusing much more kind of the urban context. Of course, we've seen other works on the urban context in different periods, but I think in particular, right, thinking about urban Catholic militancy, specifically in the 1920s, I think this definitely contributes quite a bit to the literature. A few more points and topics I want to kind of touch on, right? This is also a story of youth, right? So in particular, we're looking at a particular identity, right? This is looking at young Catholics and young Catholics who are engaged with this mindset of, look, this government's not working. We need to really bring about the kingdom of Christ and God, right? And so this is among a particular age group, and it's reinforced by each other, right? Either by family members, it's being reinforced, we've seen, or by friends, right? By networks, it's being reinforced. So that's a story of youth. The last thing I really kind of want to touch upon is political Catholicism, right? This is a term that I've seen floated around, and a term that my PhD advisor liked using too, right? Is how you combine the two. And so much, I think, of what we do in HisCat Max is focused in a sense on political Catholicism, right? that religion and politics aren't in a silo, and they do interact with each other. And so I know Dr. Guerrero was talking about depoliticization and how he was depoliticized, especially in the trial. But I want to emphasize that like his act was a form of political Catholicism, right? It's combining the two, right? He actively wanted to get rid of Obregón, and I think ultimately, right, like the post-revolutionary state. And my last comment here is I'm just thinking about all the historiographies this fits into. I always think that's interesting as a brain experiment. And whenever you read a book of which historiographies does this work fit into? And there's so many, right? So just talked about politics and religion. So political history, religious history. Of course, this is a social history. We could say that this is a cultural history too, because you've been talking about a lot about kind of the particular details of the church. And there's so many more. But those were some of the historiography I just wanted to touch upon. And to wrap up, my comments are with a set of questions, like I mentioned earlier, that I was going to ask you. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe your book is in Spanish or is available in Spanish. And so my question for los hispanohablantes en el espacio is, when are you going to have this book in Spanish? So when is it going to release in Spanish? I know that's always $1 million question, and I know that takes a lot of time and effort, but it would be wonderful, especially to have this accessible for Mexican audiences. So I think that would be something I ask you. And then, another question tied to this is what's kind of future research? Where are you heading next? Based upon this, are you kind of digging deeper into the 1920s, more on Leon Terán, more on ACJM? Are you focusing on a different period? I'd like to learn a little more about that. And then just like beyond that and beyond your own research, what do you think are the future directions of research in general tied to this book? Like what some of the things in the book that you didn't do that you feel like there's gaps and that future scholars can take on? So those are my comments, but thank you again so much for the book. I really, really appreciate it. It's one of my, don't tell anybody, it's a great book. So really enjoyed it. So thanks again.
Thank you, Nathan, for that warm and wonderful and thorough review. I feel like I'm listening to a podcast. I really enjoyed this. This is great. Thank you for that. And so I'm going to go ahead now and give Robert some time to answer the comments from Nathan and Ariadna. And then from there, we will go ahead and open the floor to everybody else for Q&A. Thank you.
Well, first, this is like the best day of my life as an author. I have this group of scholars who I admire and have been reading in some cases for years, other folks who I've been looking forward to meet. And then I have these two careful readers. And we all know the satisfaction of, there's always a gap between what we want to say and what we are actually able to say. And so when someone gets careful reading and then you're like, yes, I did it. Very gratifying. Muchísimas gracias a los dos. Me encanta, Ariadna, que hayas mencionado a Salvador Novo, un personaje que desafortunadamente no pude meter en el libro. No sabría dónde ponerlo, no sé qué relación, bueno, me puedo imaginar la relación que tendría, la opinión que le merecería a Novo José León Toral, pero es la misma Ciudad de México, es lo interesante tener personajes tan divergentes. Bueno, por eso es la metrópoli, ¿verdad? El tema de la violencia, tan interesante. ¿Cómo podemos pensar en una violencia redentora de los militantes católicos y no pensar ni siquiera de manera paralela, por lo menos explícitamente, en el papel que juega la violencia para los revolucionarios? Obviamente, ellos lo tienen muy claro. Estoy leyendo los resúmenes de la Convención de Aguascalientes y la primera página es a ver quién ha ¿Quién ha ejercido la violencia? Quien no haya ejercido la violencia no tiene derecho de estar aquí. Entonces, ¿cómo la violencia, más allá del daño físico que se hace a una persona, qué, qué valor, qué legitimidad confiere y las diferentes maneras en que se manifiesta esa legitimidad? Me parece muy interesante. Ariana, esto de la política me parece fascinante y yo me ayudaste un poco a resumirlo de manera más sucinta, que sería para el gobierno, la política confiere legitimidad al asesinato. Por ello, no quiere hablar de política. Y al revés, en el caso de León Toral, la política le resta legitimidad al asesinato. Por eso, no quiere tener nada que ver con la política. Un juego que yo pensaba que ya al final del libro, pues el lector iba a estar muy cansado y a este punto iba a pasar un poco desapercibido. Me da mucho gusto que no haya sido así. El libro lo he traducido, lo he mandado a todas las editoriales que yo conozco en México. Del fondo se dignó responderme que muchas gracias por mandar un estudio tan interesante sobre un tema tan poco conocido en México. O sea, dándome a entender que ni siquiera leyeron la propuesta, ¿verdad? Y en otro editorial, yo le dije, oye, está bien, no publiques el libro, pues si no quieres, ¿verdad? Pero ¿qué pasa? Esto es en mi humilde opinión. Y bueno, ahora voy a mandar a Nathan y a Ariana para que me segunden. Es un buen libro, ¿qué les pasa? Y me dice, claramente dice, mira, en este ambiente, no sé bien a qué se refería con este ambiente, un libro sobre León Toral, aunque sea crítico, no se va a publicar en México. Chale, pues, de haber sabido, no habría hecho todo el tiempo de la traducción. No pierdo la esperanza cuando se acerque el centenario, ¿no? Va a ser un libro que me va a llevar a la riqueza y a la fama. No sé, si alguien tiene amigos, palanca ahí con Paquito, pues ahí me pasen el dato. Las dos otras preguntas que me hace Nathan pues son evidentemente más difíciles. Estoy realizando un proyecto que es historia, ahora sí, la historia, una breve historia de la Revolución Mexicana que me pone en muchos aprietos, porque aunque tengo dos libros situados en el contexto de la Revolución Mexicana, hago uso del contexto general de manera muy ad hoc. Entonces, nunca me había visto obligado a decir, a ver, ¿qué es lo que se dijo en la convención de Aguascalientes? Yo sabía que era, no, entonces estoy revisando más detalles y sobre todo, y me gusta este tipo de investigación, entonces, algo, estoy pensando en hacer algo sobre temas más conceptuales, temas un poco más elusivos que podemos desprender de la discusión en torno a la Constitución del 17, que podría ser un tema profundamente aburrido, pero creo que hay mucho entre líneas que se puede discutir. Eh, Obviamente tiene mucho que ver con la religión, pero otras cosas también tienen su vertiente espiritual. Future direction of research tied to this book. I just would love people to read it, and that's all I could possibly ask. But I just think that there is, I don't know, there's still so much to do. There's still so much to do, which is exciting, of course. It's difficult though when I think about it. And I was writing this book, of course, in the era of the previous president, in which, and I thought that this could be, something, a nice contribution. Like, hey, how could we understand people? How could we try and relate to people we don't understand instead of just, disregarding them. And I think that maybe that could vendría bien en México también. No sé si el contexto, y menos que se acerca el 24, si se presta. So I don't know, Nate, that's up to you. that's where's this going? I don't know. I'm interested in this group, kind of what, and then be at the AHA and other conferences. I'm really excited to learn about that as well. And so I'm gonna punt on that one, or bunt, whatever the sport adjective is.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to be taking the place of Ricardo as moderator, just for the time being. Ya soy moderador para el tiempo en vez de Ricardo. Si alguien tiene una pregunta, pues puedes levantar la mano o pues pones tu pregunta en el chat. Cualquier persona que quieres.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I raised my voice.
Okay.
It's
Hi,
okay.
Julia.
You go first, Julia, and
Okay,
then I'll
Julia.
follow you.
Julia and then Christina.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see this group. And I don't know. I just am thinking. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, Robert. This is like just a for fun question. It's not a tough
Yeah.
on like the ghost of Jose de León Toral, or like the echo of León Toral. Like, is he still okay? I'm asking this because I know I've seen what our US version of Fanaticos, like traditional Catholics, mentioning on social media, mentioning him as a hero and a martyr, right? He's not a martyr because he took up arms, but it's really interesting to hear his rationale for why he considered himself a martyr. And I think other people in that sort of like traditional Catholics, new traditional Catholic circle, which I can explain what that is if you haven't, but the Latin Mass people, I don't know, we would say fanaticos, I think, for them, whoever the we is. Anyway, I guess my question is, what was that something that you saw that was interesting to you, that you're aware of, that it doesn't look like it's in the book unless I missed it, but just sort of the way that Jose de León Toral is remembered today, maybe in the US, maybe in Catholic circles, maybe in Mexico. Is this ringing any bells or something that's of interest? I'm curious.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't really have access to those circles. But just talking if we contrast him to a Padre Pro, who continues to have an important place in the iconography and of course the human rights organization, and he is a much more palatable and easy figure to embrace. Because he was, for me, like, who is a martyr? All of these things are fairly arbitrary for me, if you want, but according to any kind of rules of theology, Padre Pro is a martyr in a way that Jose Pepe could never have been. So I think that is why people have such a hard time embracing him. That's why I don't think that Padre Pro has a whole library written by Catholics and lay people and priests and nuns and foreigners and Mexicans. Catholics, for a Catholic to write a book about León Toral is a little bit more complicated, I think. But I don't know. I would ask people who know and have context, have access to those kind of circles, would know a lot more than I did. Thank you, though, Julian. Great to see you.
Thanks so much for that question, Julia. Christina.
Okay, hi. It's nice to meet you on Zoom.
Likewise.
And I haven't yet read your book, though now I really, really want to, thanks to the two comentaristas. But I'm wondering if you could maybe give an introduction to a theme of great interest, particularly to some of the researchers here, as presented in the book, and any other thoughts you might have on the embodied sex and gender of the people focused on in your book. There are some really interesting discussions on, again, people socialized female versus male, and in particular, if one advocates for violence or is involved in violence, you're sort of, it's either just unacceptable, like rhetorically and practically unacceptable, and you're a typed fanatic, in this category of just absolutely irrational people, in ways that, like, I'm curious, in examining and doing these deep studies of multiple people, Jose de Leon Toral, and some other men and other women involved, young men and women involved. Did you notice any patterns or differences along the lines of gender? Some analysts, Gemma Santamaria Klopp has mentioned this, and some others, like allowing women to be violent. It sometimes seems to be an analytical block in a lot of historical work. So again, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little more about what you found, and ways in which both different writers have treated the different historical subjects and how you handled it. And I can't wait to read your book. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you for being here. Well, I think that especially since so many revolutionaries derived a sense of virility from having exercised violence and having confronted violence and having been in battles. Violence as a sign of virility. We see this like with, Obregon's arm, or the other ones who are saying, I still have bullets lodged in my thigh. Or I forget the exact person, but there was the congressional debate about whether or not they should reform the Constitution so Álvaro Obregón could be president again. And there was one, one brave dude who stood up to oppose it, and they all said to him, "I'm sorry, what battles were you in?" And so how violence kind of conferred a kind of virility that then granted a kind of political authority. And so the title of fanatic, I would argue, somehow feminizes that violence. You're not doing it for the right reasons. You did it out of, you're a coward. You didn't face him man to man. So that adjective then also seeks to remove the virility that's associated with violence. And for the women, it's hard to get at least I had a hard time getting at, as much as I went back to your works, Christina, trying to get like the hints to it, because on the one hand, there was an older generation of women who are in the kind of first half of the book, and they are explicitly saying, the men around here just don't have their pants on, so we have to put the pants on. They're using that kind of language, and we are the ones who have to confront these the police who are coming around to see if we're having secret mass or something, and we're the ones. And so the older generation of women seem to have taken on that discourse with much more brazenly. Whereas the young women who are on the cover of my book and were closest to the friends, they were fairly content, it seems, to be kind of quiet abettors. They're like spending a lot of their time getting the men out of troubles because of their lack of thinking things through, and a lack of aptitude about being terrorists and activists. And so they're taking on kind of traditional roles of messengers and hiding arms and hiding people. But I think in that way also they are kind of the counterpart to the chicas modernas who are wearing tight dresses and dancing and enjoying some more sensual pleasures in ways that, according to the Catholics, are distracting them. Keep your eyes on the ball, girls. We need to defend the country, and defending the country means being close to Christ. And so that was kind of as close as I could get, or as close as I was able to get here, with that kind of notion of embodied sex and embodied gender. It was, of course, overwhelming for the men who, whether or not they knew how to shoot, they really liked walking around the streets with guns. But not so much for the women, who were, when they had to deal with a gun, they would wrap it in newspaper and like carefully hide it in a rebozo or something. So that contrast, I don't know, I guess the ways in which men actively look to embody their gender into their actions, whereas that same path for women doesn't necessarily lead to greater, it doesn't make it explicit.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your question. Thank you for your answer. So we have roughly 17 minutes left. So just be mindful of time for what it's worth. But next we have Margaret Chowning.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. Hi, friends. Hello, colleagues. So I don't really have a question, Robert. I just wanted to be the third comentarista here and say this is such a cool book for some of the reasons that Ariadna and Nathan have already given. I stole so much from this book for new pandemic lectures in Mexican history that I had to put a picture of it. I felt guilty. I had to put a picture of it and the Amazon link up on my PowerPoint so my students didn't think I was just that brazenly plagiarizing, because I was. It just works so well for the undergraduates because of the powerful personality kind of at the center of it, and yet there's, as everyone has said, the balance between the big themes of interest to a lot of us and real sort of human interest and human questions at the center. So, and I've also used, I turned on my graduate students to it. So it's not just an undergraduate book at all, but I highly recommend it for undergraduates. So the one thing I wanted to especially single out, and I don't think, as I say, it's not a question, but the way that the book can be used to get at the question of multiple kinds of Catholics, that sometimes in my own work, I found it really hard to avoid saying Catholic women this and Catholic women that, as if all Catholic women were the same. And I think my solution to that problem was not a very good one. Just periodically, I would say, we have to remember that, not all people are like these kind of self-selected Cofradia Pious Association leaders that are the main unit of analysis in my own work, and that's not very satisfying. But you did a great job of helping us to see other Catholics out there besides the sort of fanatic ones at the center of it. So thanks for that. That's it's not just a good book to teach with because the students like it, but it's a good book to teach with because it has that kind of, it really brings something to the discussion that a lot of us don't do very well. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Margaret. Teresita.
Hello. I have always wanted to meet you, but I never got a chance. And I lived in Boulder. I did my PhD in Boulder, and I didn't find out about your work until my final year, right before I moved away for my postdoc, of course. And it was when your book was not published yet. There was only, I think, like a working copy that they had at a book display. But I just wanted to say, so I deal with the musical manifestations of Cristeros, both past and present. And so, full disclosure, I have not yet read your book. It is at the top of my list. But going back a little bit to what Julia was asking regarding José de León Toral, I first learned about him through a ballad, through a corrido about him. And so, and the way that he is remembered, at least through the music, is very much as a martyr, and a very much an exonerated martyr, somebody who was given his last rites and forgiven of all his sins and did everything for the glory of God, and also doubly sanctified through the help of La Madre Conchita. Like, that's the way that at least the corrido depicts him. And so I just wanted to add that as, just a little bullet point to our conversation. But I wanted to know, if you are familiar with some of the artistic or musical manifestations of this militant Catholic youth at that time, or even the way that sorry, let me rephrase that. So if you're aware of any of the artistic expressions of Catholic youth at that time, because it was well documented, at least in rural communities, in balladry. And if you ever want to have a conversation about that, I would be delighted to talk to you. So that's all I have to say, but thank you so much for your talk.
Well, thank you, Teresita. The quick answer is no. I don't know anything about it. I would love to know more about it, and that'd be awesome. I found a couple ballads, or I found a couple mentions of ballads when they're like trying to make sure that people aren't celebrating him, and so they're confiscating records that people were bringing in from Texas. But no, I don't know anything about their artistic expressions at the time. That's really fascinating. And I wanted to point out this really great tip about the St. Joan brigades, that about which didn't come into my book. So I didn't mean to suggest that women at this time were always limited to just hiding guns and giving them to other men. That was the case here, but certainly not the case in these other groups of women who had decidedly taken up arms. Yeah, I want to look at some of this research that is recommended here.
Thanks again, Teresita. And I also want to thank Eve. In particular, I want to read Eve's comment for folks that are going to watch the recording or on YouTube. So just going to read Eve's comment. Thank you once again, Eve, for your comment. New researches on the St. John's Brigades are showing that their role was not only to carry weapons and pistols, but also women have been part of assassination attempts against Obregón, and also used kidnapping in order to gather money for the cause. C. Vaca, Fernando M. Gonzalez, and more recently, Edith Martinez Trujillo. So thank you again for that. Okay, Maurice, you're our last question.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. That was really interesting. I have to say I haven't read your book yet, so perhaps my questions will be answered reading your book. But you said that, of course, León Toral is a figure that is really hard to accept and celebrate in Catholic circles. But I was wondering, I mean, this is a very tense time and period in the Catholic world. I mean, we've seen in France, for example, the laws of separation and state, in Portugal as well. We have Spain, which the conflict will begin very soon in the 1930s. We have also groups, kind of fascist groups that emerge a bit everywhere in Brazil with Integralismo. And I was wondering if the reception or the way Catholics refer to León Toral in some circles was celebrated openly or not. sometimes it might be just a reference without celebrating him directly, but I don't know if you've looked into that.
In the contemporary context of the assassination, certainly. I mean, of the great caudillos, Obregón was the last. And lots of people were very happy to see him die. Lots of people had tried to kill him before. And lots of revolutionaries were like, well, I don't care if it was by a Catholic fanatic, as long as he killed him. So lots of people were very, very happy about this finally a successful assassination for someone who had accumulated so many enemies. And certainly, kind of as Teresita is pointing out, what I did have were lots of poems. I guess I'm remembering now, I had lots of poems. They're celebrating, written right that day or the next day. Odes at his cemetery, at his funeral, sorry. And lots of people, no one, of course, formal members of the church, but talking about how he was a martyr and that this was tyrannicide and celebrating him from all kinds of aspects. I've had this question before about his connection to fascism. And certainly that is how he's often understood in Mexico, as this group being the beginning of political Catholic groups like El Yunque and the Opus Dei. And my only response is that, you know, to call somebody a proto-sinarquismo, of course, for me to call anybody a proto-anything, it seems like for a historian, it's really hard to say that. How do you call somebody a proto something as a historian? What are we going forward now in time? So that maybe if, you know, this had happened a few years later, I would not have been surprised at all if Leon Toral and other folks had embraced fascism. And there certainly are voices in Mexico at this time who are saying we need to, taking on fascist language. Leon Toral and his immediate circle, at least, they weren't using that vocabulary. And I think they may well have had they been in a context where that was more burgeoned, that discourse. But certainly people of all different kinds of ideological stripes were celebrating him and his accomplishment.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Maurice, for your question. And so we are heading near the end. We actually have a few minutes in case folks do have additional questions. I see. Okay, Ben, go ahead.
I just wanted to say felicidades, Rob. It's great to see this, to see you again. And I think this book really speaks to Mexico City. I'm sorry, Professor Olson is I don't think she's here anymore, but her book is one of the outstanding ones on Mexico City. And I think the way you talk about Mexico City at this time is a wonderful perspective that I think is underrepresented in the historiography. And in terms of, Nathan, your question as to what we read this with or what's comparable, I thought of Steve Andy's book about Sofia del Valle, a very different Catholic. But getting back to Margaret's point, that I think del Valle and Toral are in some ways two opposite ends of the spectrum, but both of these books are sort of almost individual spiritual biographies. I don't know if you're comfortable with that term, Rob, but you do, I think, in a very nuanced and empathetic way, try to understand how his faith brought him to this point. So, and I'm very glad you did not put Obregón on the cover, because that kind of, I think, undoes what you're trying to do in the book, which is to look at him with fresh eyes, and an open mind. So I think you made the right call on that.
I like that title better, though, A Spiritual Biography of the Assassin of Obregón. That would have worked much better.
Well, and don't worry what Eddie says. I like Eddie, but that's how he is. He's never gonna He's never going to say you know how to pray. And one last point, I just about not reducing people to fanatics. I think of Christina's work, which has done so much, I think, to help people understand, I think, the Catholic women that are often sort of stereotyped as beatas and busybodies, and humanize them as well. So I see your work as in a different way, kind of building on that. So.
Well, this has been such a joy. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy afternoons. This has been a tremendous pleasure. I'm going to be in a great mood for the rest of the winter. And thanks again to Nathan and Ricardo and everyone else who helped to put this together. This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I want to kind of give a round of applause one more time for Dr. Robert Weis. Thank you so much for being here today in this virtual space. I want to thank Ricardo Alvarez Pimentel for moderating the first half of the session. Thank you so much, Ricardo. I also want to thank Doctora Ariadna Guerrero for providing comments. Gracias, Ariadna. And I want to thank all of you for attending, most importantly. So
Nathan, can I make one quick announcement for
go
folks
ahead.
in the room? Para los que están en México, nada más quiero dar un poco de contexto a esta presentación y me disculpo por hacer esto hasta el final porque mi hijo está en la oficina, como pueden ver. Robert nos pidió a nosotros utilizar esta plataforma precisamente porque quería conectar con académicos en México y una audiencia hispanohablante. Él nos escribió cuando nosotros mandamos el llamado, porque quiere, aunque el libro no esté publicado en español, él quiere conectar con investigadores como Ariadna, por ejemplo, y aquellos, a lo mejor algunos estudiantes de posgrado. Entonces yo les invito, por favor, a que inviten a Robert a dar presentaciones, conferencias, para que se dé a conocer más el libro, y más con el timing, con esto de COVID, pues desafortunadamente 1 o 2 años después de la publicación fue muy difícil darle ese tipo de publicidad. Entonces, si ustedes tienen eventos en sus seminarios o lo que sea, si quieren ponerse en contacto con Robert, les podemos pasar la dirección. Yo creo que sea una manera muy bonita de seguir con esta conversación, a pesar de que el libro en sí no esté en español ahorita.
Pero sí tengo el PDF que con mucho gusto comparto, si así lo quieren. Con mucho gusto. De la versión en español, obviamente.
And that was it, Nathan. Thank you.
Wow, no, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone once again. Have a great rest of your day and do take care.